think about and shout out what organisms you think live in ponds or live in the ocean, the two big aquatic environments. Water bears, tardigrades.
Microorganisms.
So zooplankton, which are usually thought of as little animals, so maybe crustaceans or shrimpy kind of things. Mammals, algae, yeah, and we'll see more of those today. Do you have a guess what might find in a pond? Fish and tadpoles, so larvae of salamanders and frogs. So we have lots of things going on in the aquatic environment. And you guys actually named a really diverse range of organisms, so including microbes and algae right from the start. So you're here because you already know something about microbial diversity, I think. But often what people think of when they think of biodiversity, and the biodiversity that might be in a pond, is something that looks more like this. So this is an image that I got by Googling biodiversity a couple years ago. And what we have here, this isn't in an aquatic system, but in a terrestrial system, we have some amphibians, we have a turtle, some butterflies, and then some flowering plants. But we just have animals and plants here for our representation of biodiversity. But that doesn't include any of those algae and the other organisms that you guys thought of. So when I was I did this a while ago when I was defending my PhD, so I kept digging and tried to find the most diverse collage of biodiversity on Google that I could. And this is what I came up with, which is definitely looking a lot better. So we have kelp here, which are a type of big, gigantic algae. We have fungi. We have different types of animals, like this jellyfish, mammals, octopus. So we have a lot more diversity going on. But it still mostly focuses on these large organisms that we can see usually when you're walking around outside, so the plants, fungi, and animals. And that's usually what people think of when they're talking about biodiversity. So this was a view of biodiversity that was first talked about in the 1960s and 70s. And it's called the Five Kingdom System because we have 5 groups of the plants, fungi, and animals, of the big things that you see when you go outside. And then all of the microbes, the protists that we're talking about, they're all down here in this group that's sort of pushed down below. And then the bacteria are down in this last group. But we can see that this is a view of biodiversity that's not really reflecting what we know now about the tree of life and all of the diversity of organisms. If we put those plants, animals, and fungi onto a representative tree of just the eukaryotes. And so this is a phylogenetic tree, which you guys might not be familiar with, but it's pretty easy to read. So each line is a group of organisms, and the closer together, if 2 lines go back and meet in a group, that means they're more closely related to each other than to other things. And so you can roughly look at it and say that things that are closer together are more closely related to each other. So we have animals and fungi down here. Turns out that they're actually really closely related to each other. So you're much more related to a mushroom than you are to a plant, which is up here. But what are all these other organisms? Are they plants or animals? Right. And so this is a representation of phylogeny, or tree, that shows our organismal relationships. And a lot of these relationships we've learned about by comparing either characters or molecular sequences from the genome of different organisms. And so the things that are more closely related, they haven't changed very much from each other. And so they're closer together on the tree. So in this case, organism 1 and 2 have almost the same set of letters or DNA sequences. And then 3's got a few more changes. So this G is changed to a C, so we have a little bit more distant relationship. and so forth. So that's one way you can think about reading a tree. The more closely, the more recent a pair of organisms share a branch, where their branches come together, the more closely related to each other they are. So if we go back to our tree and plot all of the protists on there, you can see that actually almost all of this diversity of life, they're made up of the protist lineages that were all previously pushed down into that one group called protists. So we have lots and lots of diversity that we're missing if we just consider the organisms that we see when we walk outside. And this is where those more diverse organisms fall. We still just have a few branches of the tree of life. So what does it look like? What do we see if we get a true picture of diversity? I would argue that it looks more like this. So you still have a plant here, and you have an animal here, a bird, but almost everything is some sort of microbe. You have lots of different types of amoebae. Some of them form shells, and you can see those later from the samples that Melissa collected. We have flagellates, more amoebae over here. So we have lots and lots of different types and different shapes of organisms that are doing different things. And I think this really expands our perspective on the natural world and in the aquatic ecosystems in particular, because we see lots of these organisms making up the food webs in ponds and in the ocean. So this is just those same organisms, but now placed into their branches on the tree, and you can see. So now we've filled out our biodiversity structure. Here's just another collage of microbes, and now we have bacteria and stuff around the edge. But I want to go back and talk about the food webs in aquatic systems. And we're going to focus on pond systems at first and think about the relationships between all of these organisms with really different shapes and ways of moving around. So this is a typical depiction of a food web. So a food web traces the relationships among organisms by who they eat. And that's really important because who you eat and that determines how energy flows through the system. So you get carbon moving through the systems and other nutrient cycles that are really important to determining how many organisms can live in a different environment and the diversity that you see. So organisms point to, or the arrows point to the organism that does the eating. So this eagle is going to eat this bass here, this fish, and this big fish eats crustaceans, and it might also eat some smaller fish. Crustaceans are usually thought of eating detritus, or things that have died, which might also be eaten by the zooplankton, which here are depicted as some protists, some amoebae, and some animals and the water bear might be in there as well. And all of those eat the phytoplankton, or the different types of algae. This is a pretty simplified picture, so we're going to dive into a little bit more deeply some of the relationships between these organisms. So I said that the arrow in a food web should point to the organism that does the eating. So in this picture, which way should this arrow be pointing? Should it be pointing toward this aquatic insect? Should it be pointing to the trout? Yeah, that was pretty easy, right? So the trout is definitely eating the aquatic insects. We also eat it. We try to get it we trick it by feeding it these flies that look like aquatic insects, and pull it out of the ecosystem. And then the aquatic insects, and then in turn, would be eating those microbes and the algae all around. So they eat lots of other different types of algae. So what about microbes? So we usually think of food webs in terms of big organisms and animals eating the smaller things or eating plants. Well, we can see some resemblance to that in the microbes, where we have amoebae, which sort of move around and kind of are like animals. They eat their food. They don't make it themselves. They're not photosynthetic. And then we have lots of algae that are single-celled, so they're microbes. And they are photosynthetic, just like plants. So they take energy from the sun and carbon dioxide, and they make their own food like that. And this amoeba will eat these algae a lot. And lots of different types of algae, lots of different types of amoeba and other things that are eating it. So that's one example of a link in a microbial food web. There are also lots and lots of bacteria. So for every fish that's out there, we probably have, 10,000 to 100,000 algae and protists. And for every algae or protist, you probably have 10,000 bacteria. So there are huge, huge numbers of bacteria. There are more bacteria than there are stars in the galaxy, in the universe. Lots and lots of bacteria. And of course, they're eaten by lots of other organisms. So these are all different types of protists, of eukaryotes that make their living by eating bacteria. Sometimes they are not actually in the aquatic ecosystem. This one and this one are in your gut, and they eat bacteria that are also in your gut. And many of them are outside in the pond. So we'll see some examples of those in the microscope later. What about this relationship? So these are both different types of ciliates. So they're protists that swim around, and all of these little hairs are flagella that are beating around. So what do you guys think? Should the arrow be pointing towards Didymium here, this sort of bulb-shaped ciliate, or Paramecium, this larger, longer, a little bit more streamlined ciliate? How many people vote for Didymium? Got a handful? What about for Paramecium? Okay, so we're kind of evenly split. And the Didymium is probably about half the size of the Paramecium. Does that change anyone's vote? Who votes for Paramecium now? Okay. So so I'm telling you that one of these organisms eat the other. Where are their mouths? Do they have a mouth? So in Paramecium, it's a little bit hard to see from this picture, but its mouth is right here. It's sort of along the bottom of the cell, and it can engulf its prey. In Didymium, this is its mouth right here. But it's actually really, really flexible. So this is Didymium when it's in feeding mode, and this is Paramecium. So it attaches to the Paramecium cell and sort of maneuvers it around and eventually fully engulfs the whole Paramecium cell. So the Didymium is the predator, and it's pretty ferocious, even though it's quite a lot smaller than the Paramecium. So like a python, it doesn't have to eat very often. It doesn't, because it eats these pretty big meals, and then it will divide and make more Didymium cells. So this is another feeding interaction, and this one's a little bit more obvious, maybe. This is a flagellate cell called Orsoraptor agilis, and this is a filament of green algae here. And I just want to show you guys a video that was taken by a researcher in Germany named Sebastian Hess. And so I thought, so this was named Orsoraptor. It was just discovered this year and just recently published. So there are lots and lots of protists out there that we're still finding, and we don't know their names. And so it's actually really easy if you want to name an organism. If you choose protists, it's pretty easy to go out there and find something that no one's ever seen before. So when they were naming this guy, this Orsoraptor, they chose the name because to mean robber, related to the underworld or death, and they wanted that to refer to the preference of Orsoraptor to remove those green algal parts from dead cells. So it preferentially feeds on dead cells and not the living ones. That maybe the living ones have some more defense, or they're harder to puncture open or something like that. This is a relative of Orthoraptor, even though it actually doesn't look anything like Orthoraptor in this picture. But it changes shape, and so we're going to look at videos of this one as well. Does anyone know what Viridoraptor might mean? It's got two parts. The raptor is the same as in the Orthoraptor on the previous slide. And that root that comes from the same word as raptors, like eagles and hawks. So, you guys think this might be a predator also? Yeah, probably. Does anyone know what viridi means? Yeah?
Green stuff.
It does mean green stuff, exactly. So this might be a predator of green stuff. In particular, this green stuff. So more green algae. Yep. So it feeds on the chloroplasts. And they do that, they actually do that by attaching onto the cell, and they sort of make a cut. It looks like you would see if, I don't know, if you had a laser, or probably they do it by enzymatic digestion, and they peel back part of the cell that they cut, and then they go in through that. They do it the same way every time. Pretty interesting. These guys are all related to a whole group of different amoebae that feed on algae in similar ways. So they're all predators that are either engulfing parts of the algae that, like we saw in the first part, where they were just sucking out the chloroplasts, or they puncture cells and suck out the contents. And this group overall is called Vampirellidae, their name is derived from vampires, so sucking out contents. And they're actually pretty common in nature, even though there are only about 30 species described. It's estimated that that's just a very small fraction of the diversity that's actually out there, because researchers keep going back to different environments, and they almost never see the same thing, the same vampirellid or vampire amoebae in different settings. So there's lots and lots of new ones out there to be described. In my PhD, we found one that we wanted to call Draconella after Dracula. But Sebastian, who did all this really nice work, he actually got there first, and he named it Leptophrys, which isn't as exciting, we didn't think. But it was still pretty cool that he found the same amoeba in Germany as we did in Massachusetts in the U.S. So we're seeing lots of really different organisms, lots of new diversity, but also some of them can travel very far distances. Okay, so one other puzzle or challenge to you guys: who's eating who? These are two green flagellates, so they both move they're moving their flagella around. And the size here is a little bit misleading. They're about the same size. So do you have any guess as whether the Rapeza is the predator? I see some heads nodding. What about Tetrasalmus? A few guesses for Tetrasalmus. So Tetrasalmus is a green algae related to the ones that we just saw being eaten. And Rapeza is in a totally different group of organisms called the Lianins, which are pretty common in soil and also in pond water. And you'll probably see some later looking down the microscope. Oops. And Rapeza was actually described by people working in the Biodiversity Center upstairs, and that was also described really recently in 2011. So this is another example of a new organism that people are finding when they go out and look at protists. But it does eat Tetraselmis regularly and steals their chloroplast. So it might be an example of how different groups of protists got their chloroplasts.
Why does Cerveza have like brown blobs on it? Does that have something to do with something else?
Why does Cerveza have brown blobs? I don't really know. It might actually just be from the lighting of the microscopy. And it might actually be another type of pigment. So some euglenids do have, they aren't brown, but they have red splotches all over them. So it might be a different type of pigment that it's either manufacturing or picking out from its environment.
Is that the color it produces when it's digesting? Because in the previous slide you showed when they were consuming it, they started to produce a bunch of brown stuff as they're...
Yes, they do produce brown pigments as they're digesting, as they're breaking down the chlorophyll. So that's also potentially what the brown is here in
That's what I
reproducing.
actually guessed because I thought because it might be digesting the other guy.
But this one, unlike the Orthoraptor and the Viridoraptor, it never becomes cleared. It always has a green chloroplast that it can use for photosynthesis. And that's actually, so there are lots of protists, lots of microbes out there that are both plant-like and animal-like. So they eat things and they do photosynthesis, all in the same organism. Here's another type of amoeba. This is called foraminifera. So this is actually a foraminifera tree structure. It's about 2 centimeters big. This one lives in Antarctica, and its cell body is down below in the sediment. So it's in the ocean, and it's built this tree sticking up into the water column with its pseudopods. So it's glued together all these sand grains, and then it hangs its pseudopods all off of the tree, sort of like a spider web, and uses them really similar to a spider web to catch its prey, its dinner. So this one is also predatory, and it's caught this little mysid shrimp. Yeah.
Is that just one cell that makes it up, or?
Yes, it's one cell that makes this 2 centimeter long structure. So it's a really big cell. You can see it. They actually find these, divers go down and just with their naked eye find them and mark them. And so they're really huge. In Antarctica, lots of things are really big. And when I was down there, you could pick cells without a microscope, even though they're single-celled organisms. And so this single-cell organism is eating this much smaller, multi-celled animal, which I think was pretty interesting. And they marked this tree foran, and then went back a day later, and this time the shrimp was all sort of wrapped up in pseudopods and being digested.
Is that the largest single-cell organism?
It is not the largest single-celled organism that's ever lived. It's close to one of the largest currently alive. There were relatives of this tree foram, other foraminifera, that lived hundreds of millions of years ago, like around the time of the dinosaurs. And they formed sort of football-shaped shells out of calcium carbonate. And those are actually really common in the limestones that the pyramids were built out of. So the shells, the organisms died and the shells were compressed into rocks. And so you can see those in the pyramids. So that's one of the biggest single-cell organisms. It sort of depends, though, how you define a cell. And so there are algae that live along the coast of British Columbia.
Do they have a nucleus?
These guys? Yeah, they have a nucleus. So all the organisms we're talking about, they all have a nucleus where where their genome is contained. And that's the defining feature of eukaryotes, which include the animals and plants and fungi and all the protists that we're talking about. So other things that could maybe be considered the largest single-cell organism, they have tons and tons of nuclei. thousands of nuclei, but they don't have any cell walls. And so there are algae that can be meters long that are all sort of one cell because they don't have any divisions. And you just have flow of the different nuclei in the chloroplasts all through them. But the forams actually just have one nucleus for this really huge cell. So it's very large. And people actually suck it out of you can dissect out the nucleus from the cell, and you can suck it out and do genomic work just on the nucleus itself. And these guys eat the shrimp using their pseudopods also. The shrimp the pseudopods go into the shrimp and sort of rip out different parts. So their pseudopods are really versatile. And this is another example of a foraminifera. This one builds a calcium carbonate shell, and it lives in the upper layers of the ocean. And all of these little brown dots are small algae. They're called dinoflagellates that the foraminifera is farming. So during the day, the foraminifera, all the sort of white lines you see are spikes that it makes from its shell. And it sends pseudopods out along its shell and distributes the algae around. And they all photosynthesize during the day. And at night, the foram pulls them back into its cell body and stills their sugars that they've made all day. So it's sort of farming them for its benefit. These are the same type of algae that corals have in them that is how they produce their energy. So instead of having just that one picture of zooplankton eating phytoplankton, actually microbial food webs are really complex. You have smaller organisms eating larger ones, protists eating animals, and some cells are both photosynthetic, so they're both phytoplankton and zooplankton because they also eat. So we have a lot of complexity in the food web structure